We are starting a new chapter this evening, so that's good news. It's on page 40. If you're looking at the page numbers in the Tanya itself, page 40, chapter 10. And in order for us to start this piece, let's start off by asking a question. Let me pose a question, just a broad question to you, before we actually look inside the Tanya. So the broad question I'm going to pose is this: what is a tzaddik? When we say the word tzaddik, what do we mean? Because it's a word that we use a lot. It's a word that often people use as a compliment. I think if you have a look now at what's going on in Israel, you see a lot of people, when they don't know somebody's name, they call them tzaddik. I don't know if you've seen that in a lot of the video clips that are going around. So they, hello tzaddik, instead of just saying, hey you, or even saying chaver, which was very common in Israel. Lately I've seen a lot that people are saying, hey tzaddik. So what do we mean when we call somebody a tzaddik? That's going to be that's the thrust of this particular chapter. So just for background, the first chapter actually linked us to what we're going to learn tonight, because the first chapter said that a tzaddik is not what everybody thinks. So that's useful information for us. A tzaddik is not what everybody thinks. But it's all very well to debunk a common perception, but that's no good unless you give an alternative. It's all very good to tell people what something isn't. You have to tell us, well, what is it? So in chapter 1, we established that a tzaddik is not just somebody who does good things. It's got to be a little bit more advanced than that. And in that chapter also, we introduced the fact that before a person is born, that the Gemara tells us every one of our souls, and this comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility and probably also a fair amount of guilt, knowing how the Jewish community operates. So before we were born, the neshama, each of our souls, was made to take an oath that we would be a tzaddik. So it's actually quite useful and important for us to know what that is, because if we don't know what the goal and objective is, it's unlikely that we'll ever reach it. Okay, so we have to understand what is a tzaddik. Okay, so the other thing that we learned in the first chapter is that a rasha is also not what we think. In other words, in the same way as you might compliment a person, including a person who you don't know, by calling them tzaddik, equally you could disparage a person by calling them a rasha, by calling them a bad, wicked kind of a person. So we also have to understand what a rasha is, and that really led us to the most important part of what we're going to learn about in Tanya, and that is the definition of the person who is between a tzaddik and a rasha, the person that we call a Beinoni. But we're not there yet. We're not ready to have that conversation. But that's going to be the driving conversation, actually, of the whole first section of Tanya, is to try and understand what a Beinoni is. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're starting to understand what a tzaddik is. Now, in order to get to have this information, to be able to appreciate what a tzaddik is, or a rasha for that matter, or a Beinoni for that matter, so chapter 2 told us that we have to appreciate the fact that we have two souls. There is the natural, impulsive soul, what we call the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, or sometimes it is called the nefesh hachiyunis, which means the animating soul. It's the part of us that is responsible to keep us alive. It's the part of us that drives us to have personal interests, including important personal interests, like staying alive. Tends to be quite important. So all of that is driven by the nefesh hachiyunis, or the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. And then we have a different soul, which we only get to discover through focus and through investigation. In other words, we have to learn more about ourselves in order to find the soul. And that is called the nefesh hadekis, the divine soul, which he tells us right in the beginning of chapter 2 is chelek eloka mimal mamash, literally a piece of Hashem that lives inside of us. So then, in chapter 3 and 4 and 5, we spoke about the nature of this godly soul. How does it operate? What are the different faculties? We spoke about the fact that it has 10 faculties. We spoke about the fact that it has 3 ways of engaging with the world, through thought and speech and action, and therefore the behaviors that we follow and the mitzvahs that we do and the Torah that we learn are all going to align us with Hashem through our neshama, which is obviously really important. That already gave us a sense of where we should be going in life, because obviously we want to follow the path of our neshama. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 told us about the alternatives. Told us there's a dark side to the world. And to quote somebody from our community who said very aptly the other day, that one of the key things that has happened right now with the war in Israel is that the fence that people used to try to sit on no longer exists. So now you have to pick a side. There's no more fluffing and using gray areas and blurring your opinions. You got to take a side. Now, in chapter 6, that was one of the key things that the Alter Rebbe spoke about, is that there are two very different worlds, two very different sides to the world. There's a side that is very dark and there's a side that is very illuminated. There's a side that is holy and there's a side that is outright evil. And the conflict between the Nefesh Elokis and the Nefesh Abahamis becomes a conflict for which side am I going to live in. And that's what chapter 9 spoke about. It spoke about this conflict, that at any given time we've got this tug of war happening between two parts of who we are. One is pulling for us to become holier and one which is pulling for us to become more debased. It is directly related, by the way, with the parasha that we're going to read this week, because the parasha this week is about the famous twins, Yaakov and Esav, and how they have this internal conflict before they're born, where Rivka, the mother, feels that there's this tremendous conflict. And we spoke about this when we introduced chapter 9. And she doesn't know who's the real child. She doesn't know that she has twins initially. So she thinks that there's this confused child, as we often may think that we're confused. Who's the real me? Is the real me the part of me that is pulled towards the holiness of the neshama? Or is the real me the part of me that's hedonistic and self-interested and gets angry and all those kinds of things? So chapter 9 told us that there is this conflict, and the conflict is for control. And when there is conflict for control, obviously each side has its particular set of objectives, which is exactly, this is why it's such a perfect mashal, a perfect parable, what's going on in the world, particularly what's going on in Israel right now, but it's clearly affecting large communal spaces within the whole world, is this conflict. Who is going to be in control? And the language is even language of control, right? We're going to take over the world and we're going to get the whole world to conform to a particular kind of behavior or a particular kind of law. It's really dramatic, but it's exactly what we're talking about. That on the grand scale is what happens inside every single one of us on a personal scale all of the time. There's a conflict for who's going to be in control. And we spoke about the fact that the neshama, when it defines control, means that the person will be completely focused and completely dedicated in every facet of life, thought, speech, and action, every component of the human experience, to doing exactly what Hashem wants all the time, with energy, with love, with passion, all the time. The Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, well, as we learned, the very last thing we learned at the end of chapter 9 is, whatever the neshama wants, the Nefesh HaBahamis wants the opposite, which is fascinating because that tells you that it doesn't have a true agenda. It's not like it's trying to achieve something. Its entire agenda is to derail what is happening on the healthy side. That's the whole purpose. Its entire agenda is to try and derail the neshama. It's fascinating how there are people in our world who define themselves by their own objectives, and there are people in our world who define themselves by how they can interfere with other people's objectives, particularly with healthy and with wholesome objectives. And that's again exactly what we're seeing in the world today. You've got people who stand up for values and morality and higher purpose and love. And you have other people whose entire thing is just get rid of. Like that. They're not proposing a positive solution. Just get rid of, the whole from the river to the sea concept, which sounds nice. I don't know if you've seen, there's this Israeli satire show. It's called Eretz Nehederet. And so they do these satires of all these various different movements. So one of them was about the college campuses where the kids are screaming from the river to the sea because it rhymes. So that's why they like it, because it rhymes. But nobody actually stops to think about what it really means. It's about a displacement. It's about a removal of something positive. It's not saying we're going to develop. Nobody's saying we're going to develop from the river to the sea. We're going to make some kind of a super society that the whole world will be completely inspired by. It's to say we're going to remove what is currently there. So that's exactly the thrust of the Nefesh HaBahamis is, whatever the neshama wants, I'm going to do the opposite. The only thing is, and this is really important information for us, that the reason the Nefesh HaBahamis is wired this way, and the reason the Nefesh HaBahamis wants to interfere and wants to stop us doing what we should do, is so that we should get better at what we're doing. And that was the very last thing that we learned in the previous chapter, is that the real intention of the Nefesh HaBahamis, of the animal soul, is what? That we should overcome it, that we shouldn't fall for its behavior and for its expectations and so on and so forth. It really wants to actually lose the battle against us. And the principle is that is true for any negative force in the world. No matter the rhetoric, no matter how loudly they scream, at the end of the day, deep down, if you had to get in touch with the essence of where their souls originate, they actually want to lose the battle. They actually want the world to be a godly and a holy place. And so Their job is to fight as hard as they can, so we will fight in response. And you have a look around the world right now, and you can see that the Jewish people are certainly fighting back, not just on the battleground, but much, much more importantly, in being Jewish. I'll tell you one thing from just having come from the Kinus, is every single rabbi that I spoke to, and Adafka made a point of having these conversations, every single person has at least one story of a Jew who's come out of nowhere, who in the last 4 weeks, because of what's going on in Israel, has identified that they have to be engaged with their Judaism and that they have to do something. And it's just like one story after the next story, after the next story, after the next story. Because that's the whole point. The point of the resistance is to bring out our inner strength. So that brings us to this chapter. This chapter is, now that we have discussed all the technical details, from chapter 1 to 9, we've discussed all of the technical details, that there are two souls, how the two souls operate, what happens when each soul achieves its objective, and the nature of the conflict between the two souls. Now that we have all of the technical information, we can now start to redefine who the people are, the three main categories of people that we identify in the Jewish world, which is the Tzadik, the Rasha, and the Beinoni, the so-called righteous, so-called wicked, and so-called intermediate person. We can now start to define them. So chapter 10 will talk about the Tzadik. Chapter 11, which interestingly is one of the shortest chapters in the entire book of Tanya, we'll talk about the Rasha, the wicked individual. So that also tells you a lot. We don't want to get caught up and spend so much attention on people who are not where they should be. And then from chapter 12, we'll get into this conversation about what a Beinoni is, how a person aspires to become a Beinoni, and how a Beinoni should behave, which is really the core of what the whole book of Tanya is about. The other name for Tanya, at least for the first 53 chapters of Tanya, which are an independent segment of Tanya, is Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the Beinoni, of the intermediate person. The story goes that the Alter Rebbe wrote another book called the Sefer Shel Tzadikim, the guide for a tzaddik. So obviously you have to be a very qualified tzaddik to be able to write a guide for other tzaddikim, obviously, right? But he wrote this book called the Sefer Shel Tzadikim, and unfortunately there was, as was common in those days, there was a big fire in the local shtetl, and the book was burnt. The Sefer Shel Beinonim at that point had already been distributed. But the book of Tzadik, and there was just a single copy, and it was burnt. So the Alter Rebbe took that as a sign that this is a book which should not be in mass distribution, and he never rewrote the book. So clearly, none of us is in need of the book for tzaddikim. Never became a thing, never became a bestseller. But the book of the Beinoni, that we need. So we'll have one chapter on the tzaddik, and the reason we need a chapter on the tzaddik is for two reasons. Number one, because we have to have some level of appreciation of what a tzaddik is. Number two, because in the course of learning what a Beinoni is, the more we know about a tzaddik actually helps us to understand certain key elements of what it is to be a Beinoni. Now, no, right now, that sounds very cryptic, but you'll see as we go along, you're definitely going to see elements of the tzaddik and the tzaddik's persona that are going to be relevant to the Beinoni's development. Okay? But for now, let's just analyze what a tzaddik is for a tzaddik's sake. So my question was, how would you define a tzaddik? And I see two people have already made suggestions. So let's have a look at the two suggestions that came on the chat. You obviously are welcome to suggest something in person as well. So the first suggestion is that the Rebbe said that every Jew in a war has the status of a tzaddik. Okay? I think we have to be a bit careful when we quote things, and particularly when we ascribe things to who said them. So the Rebbe spoke for sure about the fact that people who fight on behalf of Jewish people to protect us and to protect the Holy Land of Israel is automatically a tzaddik. And I don't believe that that was something that only the Rebbe said. I believe that there's quite a lot of literature that speaks to that point. So that's a really important thing to know. The second suggestion over here is that a tzaddik is somebody who's completely engaged with their nefesh elikis, with their godly soul, and that is definitely an accurate description of a tzaddik. It's not necessarily going to give us the clarity yet that we need. We have to understand, so what does that look like? When a person is totally engaged with their nefesh elikis, with their godly soul, what does it look like? Is that person, for example, is that person completely removed from normal societal concepts? Like, in other words, Does that person eat lunch? So somebody who's completely engaged with their nefesh elokis, with their godly soul. So do they eat? Like, okay, so fine, you're going to tell me they have to eat in order to survive. Fine. So would they, Hilton, there's Tanya's there on the shelf. So would they, for example, would they eat dessert? Let's put it that way. Would a tzaddik eat dessert? Because obviously you have to eat in order to survive. But maybe you don't have to eat dessert. So would a tzaddik have a business? Or is a tzaddik specifically somebody who learns Torah 24/7?
Can I to the army one?
Yeah.
So a person does he have to be in battle to have that status as a tzaddik?
Okay, good question. So the question is, does a person, having said that somebody who's fighting for the Jewish people has the status of a tzaddik, do they have to actually be in battle? It would seem that way. It would seem that they have to be either in combat or at least ready to be in combat. So in other words, if a person's in a non-combat unit, I don't think you could say that they're sacrificing their life for the Jewish people. But somebody who is in a combat unit who's willing to protect Jewish lives at all costs, and that's why be careful also with just the word army, because there are other places that people would do similar things to protect Jewish lives. That would be considered a tzaddik. Okay, so
outside of military conflict in normal life.
Okay, so the thing is this, what I wanted to get to is, in the same way as when you walk down the street and you see another Jew and you don't know their name, so you decide you're going to call them Tzadik, hey Tzadik, instead of saying, excuse me sir, right? Say, hey Tzadik. So we have to be careful, because when we assign the word Tzadik to somebody, it is also in context. When I say tzaddik to a person on the side of the road, I'm not making a comment about their true spiritual nature. I'm saying that I see them as a good person. And I see them as a holy person. And that's what I'm trying to convey. But I'm not giving them a full analysis. So, like, for example, if a person had to go to their doctor for a physical, it's very different to meeting your doctor at a social function and the doctor says, you're looking good. It's really different, right? So we've got to we really have to define the difference between using the word tzaddik in a very generalized sense and understanding what the word tzaddik means in its full complexity. The objective of this chapter is to understand tzaddik in its full complexity. So now, let's say that a person sacrifices their life for a fellow Jew, whether that be in a military context, whether it be in another context, it doesn't make a difference. Somebody is willing to sacrifice their life for another Jew. Does that make them a tzaddik? Yes. Have they had the full experience of the complexity of what a tzaddik is? No. So we have to be able to distinguish these things and understand the difference between being a tzaddik in the moment or in a context versus being a tzaddik in essence. Now, the Alter Rebbe already addressed this right in the first chapter, because in the first chapter he told us that there's a difference between what is called Shem HaMushal, which is a borrowed term, and Shem HaToyar, which is an adjective. Sometimes we borrow a term in order to, and appropriately, it's not an inappropriate, we call that person tzaddik, it's not inappropriate, but you've borrowed the term. You're not doing a full spiritual analysis of where they are. Whereas here, we're analyzing a tzaddik in its fullest sense. It is possible for a person to skip the queue. It's possible for a person to turbo boost themselves because of a particular really radical action, like sacrificing their life, where they become a tzaddik. But a person who sacrifices their life doesn't then live as a tzaddik. They become a tzaddik. Does that make sense? They become a tzaddik, and now they're no longer alive because they've sacrificed their lives. Whereas here we're talking about a person who lives as a tzaddik. In other words, this is somebody who invests on an ongoing basis in order to maintain the complexity of being a tzaddik, which is not so simple as just a single action. So we have to be clear about these things, that we don't mix our metaphors. Does it make sense? Okay.
Good, yes, it makes absolute sense.
Okay, so now we've got to understand. So let's first start off with the most common mistake that people make around a tzaddik. Any idea what that might be? The most common mistake that people make when they're trying to work out who is a tzaddik, because people are consistently talking about tzaddikim and about the fact that we have we have righteous individuals in our communities, and so obviously we want to assign the tag tzaddik, the designation tzaddik, to somebody who we look up to, somebody who we respect, and it's quite widespread, right? That people will refer to a tzaddik. Question is, what do you think is the most common mistake that people make when they are trying to define a tzaddik? Okay, so Gary's saying over here, a tzaddik is somebody who does not sin. Now, the truth of the matter is that could actually be a mistaken definition of a tzaddik. Okay, so that's a really good point. I don't know if it's the most common, but it might be.
Is it tzaddik
Might be.
somebody who devotes himself to the service of Hashem?
Somebody who devotes themselves to the service of Hashem, which is similar to saying somebody who doesn't sin. Just like one is focused on the positive side and one is focused on the avoidance of the negative. So these are both common mistakes. If we think that a tzaddik is somebody who is dedicated to Hashem, or even if we think that a tzaddik is somebody who does not sin, in both cases, we're making a similar mistake. In other words, we're defining a tzaddik on behavior. So either we're highlighting that they don't have bad behavior, or we're highlighting their great behavior. But the mistake is essentially the same mistake. We're identifying a tzaddik on behavior. So that's going to be a serious mistake, as we shall see. So what I really thought people would say, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's not the most common mistake, but I do feel that one of the most common mistakes that people make about a tzaddik is that they naturally align how learned somebody is with how much of a tzaddik they are. So you find that very often, that when you have people who are, let's say, the heads of yeshivas, or even the heads of entire movements within the Jewish world, very often in order to be that head, it has to do with Torah knowledge and dedication to Torah study. So both of those things, not just somebody who happens to be brilliant and if they have an encyclopedic knowledge, they're dedicated to Torah learning and they know a lot of information. So we make the mistake of thinking that because somebody is learned, automatically that qualifies them as a tzaddik. And therefore, if they are the most learned, then that would qualify them as the greatest tzaddik. Now, unfortunately, that model is an inaccurate model. And the reason for that is because just because somebody is intellectually capable tells us nothing about their spiritual development. Not only that, it is possible for a person to be deeply invested in Torah learning, which means time and energy and knowledge. So they're learning many hours a day and they invest a tremendous amount of energy into it and they develop a massive wealth of knowledge of Judaism, and it may have no meaningful spiritual component. That is possible. Because if we were to compare it, for example, to other areas of academia, just because a person is an incredible academic is in no way an indicator that they're a good human being, let alone a spiritual human being. And we don't have to look too far, because right now, all the great name universities, the big Ivy League universities, the great academics of the world are showing, many of them, that they don't have a moral compass. And that they don't have a sense of spiritual value. They're talking heads. Tremendous amount of information. So we have to be really, really careful not to conflate knowledge with being a tzaddik. And not to conflate the concept of somebody being a Rosh Yeshiva, or a Gaon, or a Talmid Chacham, or whichever nice title we decide to give to somebody because they've mastered a tremendous amount of learning. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that automatically equals tzaddik, because it doesn't. And the converse is true. Just because a person is not the greatest scholar or intellect doesn't rob them of the opportunity to be tzaddik, which is also quite a shift for people. In fact, one of the great injustices in the Jewish community, or at least I should say in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, that the Baal Shem Tov came to address was that at that time, in the mid-17th century, the chasm in the Jewish community was created by the people who were intellectual giants, Torah scholars, who had a negative perspective on Jews who were not as intellectual or not as knowledgeable. So they created a division based on academics. And the Baal Shem Tov wanted to teach them, and successfully eventually did so, that there might be simple Jews who are true tzaddikim and learned Jews who are far from tzaddikim. So very often, people naturally just follow the path. If somebody is a very great scholar of Torah, they must by default be a great tzaddik. Let's clear that notion right from the beginning. That is not what defines tzaddik. The degree of learning is not going to be what defines tzaddik, and definitely the degree of intelligence is not going to define tzaddik, because tzaddik is a moral choice rather than a genetic gift. Somebody who's smart didn't do anything to be smart. Hashem gifted them with that. Somebody who's a tzaddik had to have developed themselves to become a tzaddik, although, important caveat over here, there may be some tzaddikim who are also gifted with being a tzaddik, but we'll talk about that. When we get to that point, we'll talk about it. Sometimes there is the gift of being a tzaddik, which is a fascinating concept, but we'll get there. So what have we clarified before we start? Because sometimes before you start, you got to get rid of the misconceptions. So what have we clarified? A tzaddik is not a function of knowledge. A tzaddik is not a function of learning. Learning will be a big part of it. It's not a function of knowledge. Because you've learned, therefore you're a tzaddik. Likewise, a tzaddik is not defined by behavior, even though that is the most common way that people understand a tzaddik. That a tzaddik is somebody who either never sins or is somebody who always does what Hashem wants. The problem with that is we then would include a far broader group of people in the category of tzaddik, if that's how we define it. Also, we don't really know what goes on internally. So let's just use an example. Let's say, and we will talk about this a little bit later on in Tanya, but let's just say, for example, you've got somebody who has no personality. And because they have no personality, they never sin. That doesn't mean that they're a tzaddik. That just means they have no personality. So we shouldn't confuse the two. And I guess the corollary is also true. If somebody spends all of their time learning and davening, I don't know that they're a tzaddik. They might just be an introvert who happens to enjoy the quiet of either learning or davening because it satisfies them. I don't know that they're a tzaddik. So behavior is also not going to be a good indicator for us of a tzaddik. So learning is not a good indicator, and behavior is not a good indicator, which then leaves us with a big problem. What other tools do we have to assess people? The only way that we assess people is we watch their behavior, or we see how much they know. And if neither of those is going to be a reliable rubric to decide who's a tzaddik, how then are we ever going to decide who's a tzaddik? Which is a really good question. Of course, we have to then ask ourselves one other question, and that is it our responsibility to start defining if somebody is a tzaddik or not? Is it our responsibility? What would you say? Do you think we have a responsibility to work out who's a tzaddik?
I don't think we know how to.
We don't know how to, right? So Gary says it's impossible to identify who's a tzaddik.
So
right?
why does it matter to us?
Why does it matter to us? So, why does it matter to us, right? Now, the answer to that is this. First of all, the Alter Rebbe would not give us a chapter in Tanya about a tzaddik if it had no value. So there's obviously something about a tzaddik that we have to know. We're going to have to work out what it is. What is it about a tzaddik that we have to know? But the simplest thing would be, because so much of our history and our liturgy and our literature includes descriptions of tzaddikim, and there's an expectation that somebody who's a tzaddik is supposed to be somebody who we learn from in a way that is different. Of course, we're supposed to learn from every single human being. That's what the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us. Ezu Chacham, who is a wise person, Alomed Mikol Adam, somebody who learns something from everybody, which is true. But needless to say, the lesson we learn from the street sweep or from the checkout clerk is going to be a little different to the lesson that we learn from somebody who we hold on a high spiritual pedestal, obviously. So then there is value in us knowing who a tzaddik is, because there's certain things that are going to be absolutely critical to Judaism if you know who a tzaddik is. If a tzaddik says something, you have to listen much more carefully than if an ordinary person says something. And if a tzaddik models a particular kind of behavior, then I know that I should follow that kind of behavior. Whereas if somebody is just learned but not a tzaddik, maybe I don't have to follow the behavior that they model. So there is going to be value in knowing who a tzaddik is. It's going to help us. A big segment of the whole Jewish experience is to learn from the tzaddik. So it is going to be important for us, and therefore we're having this conversation. Seeing as the previous chapter ended by telling us about the conflict between the Nefesh Elikis and the Nefesh Abahamis, the godly and the animal soul, each one vying for control of the human being and his or her experiences, so that's where we're going to launch our conversation over here about what a tzaddik is, right at the beginning of chapter 10 on page 40. Perek Yud. Vehine. The first thing we're going to learn over here is that in order for a person to become a tzaddik, the person is going to have to work. You're going to see that the very first verb that we use in this chapter, firstly, it's a verb, so that's important. And secondly, it is an active verb. It's not a passive state. You don't sit back and wait to be endowed with tzaddikhood. It's not like you go to sleep at night and you say a prayer and then you wake up in the morning, you're a tzaddik. Something's got to happen. Says the Alter Rebbe, Vehine, Keshe ha'adam magbir nafshoy ha'elikis. There's that verb. It's an active verb. Magbir. Magbir comes from the word gevura. What's gevura? Strength. Magbir is the act of using your strength. In fact, the word magbir means a little bit more than that. Magbir means to overpower. So if gevura means power, magbir means to overpower. So when a person gets to a stage that they overpower or they use the power of their nefesh elokis, of their godly soul, to overpower its opponent, so there you've got a massive clue right now. Tzaddik is a dynamic position. Magbir, the person has to do something. They have to find inner strength. They have to drive themselves. They have to in a sense, fight, because that's what he's going to tell us next. Venilcham, and the person battles. Now, battle is a word that is not chosen lightly. Let's remind ourselves that the Alter Rebbe spent 2 decades writing Tanya. And one of the things that made it such a long process was that he would agonize over the choice of words in any context to make sure that it was the best suited choice of words. To use the word nilcham, battle, is intentional. It's a battle to get the nefesh elokis to have the upper hand. It's not the natural state of the human being. Natural state of the human being, let's be honest, what's the natural state of a human being? Selfish. Natural state of the human being, look at a baby. I know everybody loves babies. The reality is, as much as we love babies, they are the most selfish individuals on the planet. Completely selfish. Why is that? Because the baby has absolutely no access to using the nefesh elokis. Does the baby have a godly soul? Yes. Is the baby aligned with its godly soul? In many ways, yes. That's why babies have a purity and innocence about them. But is the baby able to access and use the animal soul? Not at all. So the only part of the baby that is functional is the animal soul, which is completely selfish. Therefore, what does the baby spend all day doing, 24/7?
Eating and sleeping.
Getting what it needs. At the expense of other people. So there's no concept of consideration. We might just simply say that it's a lack of maturity. Okay, fine. So part of maturing is realizing you have a deeper soul. But the baby's not capable of discovering or thinking or realizing that mothers get tired, although it's not the best time of the day to eat, etc. So you don't just grow up, as much as we'd like to, right? You don't just grow up. Okay, interesting question. Does a person also have to have empathy? I'm not sure if you're asking, does a tzaddik have to have empathy? Or are you asking, yeah, tzaddik. Okay, does a tzaddik have to have empathy? Okay, so hold that question for a second or two, because I think as we go through the description of what a tzaddik is, the answer should resolve of its own accord. Okay, so just let's hold that thought for a second. So, so coming back, so the nature of, okay, so a person grows up and they mature, right? And a child gets to realize that you don't have to scream at 3 a.m. in order to eat. You know, you start to learn various things about the world. The single most difficult thing to do in life is something that we don't feel like doing. I mean, this is not rocket science. This is not, I haven't now introduced a revolutionary concept that nobody has ever heard in their life. And one of the fascinating things when you talk to people is without realizing it, how biased we are about our own situations. So let's say, for argument's sake, little example, right? How difficult is it to come to a Tanya Shir on a Wednesday evening? Well, the answer is simple. If you're sitting here, you don't find it that difficult. So you talk to the next person, you say, you really should come to the Shir. What do they say? This and that, and the timing, and the this, and a whole string. Trust me, I'm in the rabbi business. I know all of the excuses, the creativity of the Jewish community when it comes to, skipping shul or shir and whatever is very, very impressive. So we look at them and we say, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? You come to the shir, you'll learn something, you'll appreciate it. That's really funny. Shimron says in the chat that his baby's listening to what I was saying about babies. Hope I didn't offend anybody. So you come to the shir, you'll learn something, maybe you feel a little bit better about yourself, you feel a little bit inspired. So you tell the other person, what's your problem? What's the problem? There is no problem, except that the most difficult thing to do is something we don't feel like doing. That's how we are wired. So that means that's not just the things that we don't feel like doing in a spiritual context, it's right across the board. Why do people have a difficult time exercising? Why do people have a difficult time dieting? Why do people have a difficult time being nice to each other? Why do people have a difficult time telling the truth? Why? Because the way we are designed is the Nefesh HaBahamis is the stronger, more accessible force in our lives, and the Nefesh HaBahamis just wants me. So that's why he uses the word over here, V'nilcham. To get the godly soul to have a word in edgeways, to get the godly soul to make its voice heard, is a battle. This might, we're talking over here about a tzaddik, and of course we're not all going to become a tzaddik, but this might be one of the most valuable thoughts for us to carry with us as we try to grow as people. Expect a battle. Nobody grows on a downhill, on an easy slope, on freewheeling. The only way we grow is v'nilcham. It's a battle. So what makes a tzaddik? What makes a tzaddik is how much they have fought that battle. Every one of us has some level of fighting the battle of our own spiritual development. Some level. If you come to the shir, you didn't come to the shir because it was easy. Every single week that you come to the shir, you had a little internal battle. Some weeks a bigger battle, some weeks a smaller battle, right? So to be honest, I got off a plane this morning, late morning, having not slept last night, big Farbrengen in New York the night before. I was like, do you think anybody would mind if we put the shir till next week? Let's just delay it till next week, because I'm walking around in a bit of a dwell over here. Thank God, somehow, the Nefesh Elokis won this round, so we're having a shir, right? But every single week, to a greater or a lesser extent, there's always going to be some niggling Nefesh HaBahamis voice that we have to fight. And every one of us knows in our own lives, sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. And this is, we're not going to talk about what the ratio is at this point. That's something you can think about in your own time. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. The first clue to the tzaddik is how substantially the tzaddik wins the battle. V'nilcham, look at the expression over here. V'nilcham kol kach. Battles so much. Everybody battles. Question is, how much? How successfully? How much do we throw ourselves into the battle? So the success of the tzaddik is that nilcham kol kach im habahamis, that his divine soul fights so successfully against the animal soul, ad shemegoresh umevoer hora sheba micholol asmoli, to the extent that it forces the negative out of the so-called metaphorical left ventricle of the heart, which is supposed to be the seat of the Nefesh HaBahamis. Kamoisha Kosov, like the Pasuk says, Ovi'arta hora mikirbecha. When the Torah talks about idolatry in the land of Israel, it says that you should completely excise all the bad, all the evil from amongst you. Here we're translating it a little differently. Mikir Becha in the pasuk sounds like from amongst you, you the nation living in the land of Israel. You have to get rid of idolatry from within your ranks. But here we're learning it Mikir Becha in the singular, from inside yourself. Mikir Becha, get rid of the bad that is inside yourself. This is what distinguishes a tzaddik from the rest of us. Let's put this into language we can all understand. Okay, so let's say that you didn't feel like coming to the shiur tonight. I know I'm harping on this particular example just to keep it consistent. You didn't feel like coming to the shiur tonight, but you came anyway. So that's one round in favor of the Nefesh Elikis. Is the Nefesh HaBahamis out of action? Is this a TKO? Is the animal soul gone? That's it. We have now mastered this area of our spiritual development. We're never going to have to fight again. We'll always be seamlessly at the shiur every single week in perpetuity. Not at all. Why not? Because we haven't changed the Nefesh HaBahamis. We've just beaten it in this round. And as long as it remains an opponent, there will be more rounds. And as long as there will be more rounds, there will always be the possibility of losing a round. And that's life, right? That's what everybody will tell you. That's life. You win some, you lose some. You make some progress, you regress. So it's not just a function of behavior that makes it tzaddik. It's a function of whether there is still an opponent or not that makes it tzaddik. What is the definition? He jumps right into it at the beginning of this chapter. What is the definition of the tzaddik? Somebody who's nilcham kol kachim abahamis, who fights so hard and therefore successfully against the animal soul, until he excises the negative that is inside it. Which means this: is the nefesh abahamis bad? The animal soul. Is the animal soul bad? And the answer is no. In chapter 6, when we introduced the idea of klippa, which are forces that create a barrier or obstruction to godliness and to holiness, we said there are two kinds of klippa. There is klippa that is absolutely bad, klippa tmeya, completely bad, completely unhealthy, totally toxic. And then there's klippa, which is called klippas noiga, which is technically neutral and can be corrupted, or it could be elevated. The nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, is klippas noiga. It is not bad. The fact that the nefesh habahamis cares about me is actually a good thing. Because if I didn't have a part of my makeup that cared about me, what would keep me alive? How would I survive? I have to have a survival instinct. And my survival instinct has to be selfish. So that's what I'm saying. Good point. Good question. How does the tzaddik survive if he eradicates his nefesh habahamis? That's why the Alter Rebbe does not say you eradicate the nefesh habahamis. He says you excise the bad from the nefesh habahamis. In other words, the part of the nefesh habahamis that is corruptible, the part of the nefesh habahamis that is susceptible to bad behavior, that the tzaddik completely succeeds in getting rid of. So let's put it this way. Let's say that there's a particular neighborhood that has a crime problem. We'll keep it simple. We'll say that the crime problem is that there are street kids who break into cars and houses. That's the nature of the crime problem. Now they're street kids. They're not yet hardened gang members or, they're street kids who haven't been taught the right values, and they don't respect other people's property, and they feel a certain sense of self-preservation and desperation, so therefore they steal. Is it justified? No, it's not justified. Can it ever be justified? No. So what do? You bring into that neighborhood very strong, number one, security. So now you make sure that there is no crime, but you don't stop there. What you actually do is you educate these kids. And you teach them real responsibility, and you allow them to learn how to use their innovation, because in order to be a ganef, you actually have to have some skills. So you've got to be precarious, you've got to be, you've got to be precocious, not precarious, you've got to be precocious, you've got to have a bit of chutzpah, you have to have a sense of self-confidence, you have to do things that come with a risk, you have to innovate, you have to plan. So you take all of that and you teach the kids how to use that in a positive way. You're not you're not locking them away. You're getting rid of the negative inclination that was developing inside of them. They're not yet hardened criminals. Hardened criminals, different story. That's proper klippa. It's got to be dealt with differently. But a kid who doesn't know any better, who's behaving in a particular way because there's no parental guidance or because there's no societal structure, and we help and we guide them, actually become an asset to society. And that's what a tzaddik succeeds in doing. The tzaddik succeeds in getting that nefesh habahamis to still be a nefesh habahamis with all of its abilities, with all of its, so to speak, talents, without its criminal side. So self-preservation now becomes, well, in order to preserve myself, I also have to look after my soul. I have to feed my soul. So instead of saying self-preservation is I have to make sure that I have the fanciest meals in town, or I go on the best vacations, or I live in the best house, I have to make sure that I'm learning from the best teachers, and that I have the best access to be able to do what Hashem wants, etc., etc., etc. So that's the first insight into a tzaddik. A tzaddik is not defined by behavior, because behavior could mean that there is still an ongoing struggle and I just win more rounds. A tzaddik is defined by the neutralizing of the threat. Therefore, there will be no rounds to lose in the future. Okay, that's obviously to be continued. So a lot to unpack over here in terms of a tzaddik.